Hello there. What am I reading? Just some Brothers Grimm. Fairy tales the way they originally were. Not every fairy tale has a happy ending, but I like it like that. It's more original, more real, and each story has a moral or something you can take away from it. What am I reading? This time it's Our Lady's Child. Near the great forest dwelt a woodcutter with his wife, who only had a child, a little girl 3 years old. They were so poor, however, that they no longer had daily bread, and they did not know how to get food for her. One morning the woodcutter went out sorrowfully to his work in the forest, and while he was cutting wood, suddenly there stood before him a tall and beautiful woman with a crown of shining stars on her head, who said to him, "I am the Virgin Mary, mother of the child Jesus. You are poor and needy. Bring your child to me. I will take her with me and be her mother and care for her." The woodcutter obeyed and brought his child and gave it to the Virgin Mary, who took her up to heaven with her. There the child fared well, ate sugar cakes, drank sweet milk, and her clothes were of gold, and little angels played with her. And when she was 14 years of age, the Virgin Mary called to her one day and said, "Child, I am about to take the long journey, so take into your keeping the 13 keys of heaven. 12 of these doors you may open, and behold the glory which is within them. But the 13th, to which this little key belongs, is forbidden. Beware of opening it, or you will bring misery on yourself." The girl promised to be obedient. When the Virgin Mary was gone, she began to examine the dwellings of her kingdom of heaven. Each day she opened one of them until she had made the round of the 12. In each of them sat one of the apostles in the midst of a great light, and she rejoiced in the magnificence and splendor. All the little angels who were always accompanying her rejoiced with her. The forbidden door alone remained, and she felt a great desire to know what could be hidden behind it, and said to the angels, "I will not quite open it, and I will not go inside, but I will unlock it just so we can see a little through the opening." "Oh no," said the little angels, "that would be a sin. The Virgin Mary has forbid it, and it might easily cause you unhappiness." Then she was silent, but the desire in her heart was not stilled, and gnawed there, and tormented her, and let her have no rest. And once the angel had all gone out, she thought, "Now I am quite alone. I could peep in. If I do it, no one will ever know." She sought out the key, and when she got it in her hand, she put it in the lock. And when she put it in, she turned around as well, and the door sprang open, and she saw there the Trinity sitting in the fire of splendor. She stayed there a while and looked at everything in amazement, and then she touched the light with her little finger, and her finger became quite golden. Immediately a great fear fell on her. She shut the door violently and ran away. Her terror, too, would not quiet her. Let her do what she might, and her heart beat continuously and would not be still. The gold, too, stayed on her finger and would not go away, no matter how much she rubbed and washed it. It was not long before the Virgin Mary came back from her journey, and she called the girl before her, and she asked to have the keys of heaven back. When the maiden had given her the bunch, the Virgin looked into her eyes and said, "Have you not opened the 13th door also?" "No," she replied, and she laid her hands on the girl's heart and felt how it beat, and saw right well that she had disobeyed her in order to open the door. Then she said once again, "Are you certain that you have not done it?" "Yes," said the girl for the second time. But then she perceived the finger which had become golden from touching the fire of heaven, and saw that the child had sinned, and for the third time she said, "Have you done it?" "No," said the girl for the third time. Then the Virgin Mary said, "You have not obeyed me, and besides that you have lied. You are no longer worthy of heaven." Then the girl fell into a deep sleep, and she woke laying on the earth below, in the midst of the wilderness. She wanted to cry out, but she could bring forth no sound. She sprang up and wanted to run away, but wherever she turned herself, she was continually held back by thick hedges and thorns which she could not break. In the desert which she was so imprisoned, there stood a hollow tree, and this had to be her dwelling place. Into this she crept at night, and here she slept. Here too she found shelter from storm and rain, but it was a miserable life, and bitterly did she weep, and she remembered how happy she had been in heaven, and for how the angels played with her. Roots of wild berries were her only food, and for these she searched as far as she could go. And in the autumn she picked up the fallen nuts and leaves and carried them into the hole. But the nuts were her food in winter, and when the snow and ice came, she crept amongst the leaves like a poor little animal that she might not freeze. Before long her clothes were all torn. One bit of them after another fell off of her. As soon, however, as the sun shone warm again, she went out and sat in front of the tree. Her long hair covered her on all sides like a mantle. Thus she sat year after year, and felt the pain of misery of the world. One day, when the trees were once more closed and fresh green, the king of the country was hunting in the forest, and followed a deer as it had fled into the thicket which was shut in this part of the forest. He got off his horse and tore the brush asunder, and cut himself a path with his sword. When he had last forced his way through, he saw wonderfully a beautiful maiden sitting under a tree, and she sat there and was entirely covered with her golden hair down to her very feet. He stood still and looked at her full of surprise, and when he spoke, he said, "Who are you? Why are you sitting here in the wilderness?" But she gave no answer, for she could not open her mouth. The king continued, "Will you go with me to my castle?" Then she just nodded a little. The king took her in his arms and carried her to his horse, and rode home with her. And when he had reached his royal castle, he caused her to be dressed in beautiful garments, and gave her all the things in abundance. Although she could not speak, she was still so beautiful and charming that he began to love her with all of his heart, and it was not long before he married her. After a year or so had passed, the queen brought into the world a son. Thereupon the Virgin Mary appeared to her at night, when she lay in her bed alone, and said, "If you will tell the truth and confess that you did unlock the forbidden door, I will open your mouth and give you back your speech. But if you persevere in your sin and deny obstinately, I will take your new-born child away with me." Then the queen was permitted to answer, but she remained hard and said, "No, I did not open the forbidden door." The Virgin Mary took the newborn child from her arms and vanished with it. The next morning, when the child was not to be found, it was whispered among the people that the queen was a man-eater, and had killed her own child. She heard all of this, and could not say anything to the contrary, but the king would not believe it, as he loved her so much. A year had gone by. The queen bore another son. In the night the Virgin Mary came to her, and said, "If you will confess that you opened the forbidden door, I will give your child back and untie your tongue. But if you continue in sin and deny it, I will take him away with me, this new child also." The queen said again, "No, I did not open the forbidden door." Then the Virgin took the child in her arms and carried away with her to heaven. The next morning this child had also disappeared. The people declared quite loudly that the queen had devoured it, and the king's counselors had demanded that she be brought to justice. The king, however, loved her so dearly that he would not believe it, and commanded the counselors under pain of death not to say more about it. The following year the queen gave birth to a beautiful little daughter, and for the third time the Virgin Mary appeared to her in the night and said, "Follow me." She took the queen by the hand and led her to heaven, and showed her there her two eldest children, who smiled at her and were playing with a ball of the world. When the queen rejoiced at this, the Virgin Mary said, "Is your heart not yet softened? Will you own that you opened the forbidden door? I will give you back your two little sons." But for the third time the queen answered, "No, I did not open the forbidden door." And the queen virgin let her sink down to earth once more, and from her took likewise the third child. The next morning, when the loss was reported abroad, the people cried, "The queen is a man-eater, she must be judged." But the king was no longer able to restrain his counselors. Thereupon a trial was held. As she could not answer and defend herself, she was condemned to be burned alive. The wood was got together, and when she was fast bound to the stake, the fire began to burn around her. The hard ice of pride melted. Her heart was moved by repentance, and she thought, "If I could but confess before my death that I opened the door." Then her voice came back to her, and she cried loudly, "Yes, Mary, I did it!" And straightway rain fell from the sky and extinguished the flames of the fire. And a light broke before and above her, and the Virgin Mary descended with two little sons by her side and the newborn daughter in her arms. She spoke kindly to her and said, "He who repents his sin and acknowledges it is forgiven." Then she gave her three little children, untied her tongue, and granted her happiness for her whole life.